So, this is a video on reentry. My name is Jesse Crosson, and I was arrested just after my 18th birthday. I was sentenced to serve 32 years in prison for a robbery and a non fatal shooting I committed. So, at 18 years old, I was basically told I'd be in prison for the next 30 years, and what was I going to do with my life? And I felt hopeless. But I made a lot of changes on the inside. And one of the things about reentry is that reentry really does start on day one, and that's a catchphrase for a lot of the DOCs, and they don't actually do anything about it. But we, as people who are incarcerated, have the opportunity to do that. And that was one of the things that prepared me, is because my mindset and my habits and my activities, everything I did was looking toward the future of how am I going to be able to be successful. As an example, I worked a bunch of different jobs in prison. Every time I had the opportunity to do something new, even though I was comfortable where I was, I chose to go into that new space so I could learn. So I worked in the law library, I was a tutor, I worked in the factory, I worked maintenance, and through this, I learned to use, office software. I learned to work on electronics, I learned to work on electrical, learned to do plumbing, I learned to do basically a little bit of everything because I didn't know what opportunities would be open in front of me. I didn't know if I'd have to get a trade job, if I'd end up in an office. I wanted to have as many skills as possible. So then my reentry, by the way, was unusual because in August of 2021, I received a conditional pardon. The governor basically said, hey, it's been 19 years, you're 32-year sentence. Like, I think you've done enough. That was already more than the high end of the sentencing guidelines. This doesn't make sense. You've done good stuff. Good luck. So I walked out into the world of COVID with only an hour and a half's notice. Now, normally, depending on the state or depending on the system, there's reentry planning. There's some work to essentially put a plan in place or put resources in place or put a path in place. What I usually tell people is it's far better to have options than it is planned, because if you only have a plan and then something goes wrong with that plan, what are you going to do? What are you left with? Whereas with options, it's like a wide array, and you can continue to choose options and create more options for you or create paths forward rather than just one plan that depends on going in a certain direction. But getting out, yeah, I got out with an hour and a half's notice. I was not prepared. I didn't have plans in place, but I had created options because of the choices I made while I was incarcerated. So I got out, and because I had started this social media campaign, or I hadn't, my mother had started the social media campaign of sharing my essays and sharing my writing as related to my clemency petition, I had a lot of supporters. So when she announced that I was released, all of a sudden I had these messages coming from people about, hey, do you need a ride? Do you need a car? Do you need a job? Do you need a place to live? So I had a lot of support, and most people don't have that. So those are the things we can do prior to release. Now, unfortunately, that's what the state should be doing, is essentially helping, build connections and give people the opportunity to be able to succeed and have everything they need. But I knew they wouldn't. Like, I knew that the DOC, as well-intentioned as some individuals may be, though not most, they're just not going to do it. So I had to do it myself. I had to figure out a way to build those connections. Because otherwise, yeah, you get out and you got nothing. I have friends who have gotten out, haven't had a place to live, have literally gotten basically a voucher for a week in a hotel, and then that's it. They're out on the street. So you go from being in prison where, yeah, it's uncomfortable and it's unpleasant, but they feed you, you have a place to live, to being told after a week, like, good luck, you're going to be homeless, like, be on the street, like, go line up for the soup kitchen. I hope you can find a tent or somebody to donate a blanket or whatever. It's a really untenable situation because there really is no preparation. That said, if people put in the work and if people are lucky enough to have some sort of connection, or if they're not, if they're willing to go and talk and basically plead and beg and knock on every door, go to every church, go to every 12-step meeting, go to every service group, go to every organization, and a lot of guys don't want to do that. And I understand, I don't want to do that. I don't think anybody wants to do that. At the same time, it's a question of, are we willing to do what we have to do to try to get forward? And that said, it's not an easy process. Like, for weeks, for months, I was regularly finding myself in a fetal position, just like overwhelmed and having a breakdown and not understanding and shaking because I was just reliving or kind of like releasing the trauma from all those years in prison. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend The Body Keeps the Score. It talks about how trauma is trapped in the body and how, as we get to a place of safety, it starts to come out. And one of the things I've talked to my therapist about is that after all those years of having to keep stuff inside and kind of like wear my armor, all of a sudden when I got out, I started freaking out. I was like, what's going on? I could survive in prison. Why am I freaking out here? But as they said, or as my therapist said, well, yeah, you're finally in a place that's safe enough to let that stuff out, to let down your guard. So that said, there are all sorts of challenges for somebody getting out of prison. Challenges around the basic, like the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. Like, how are you going to find a place to live? How are you going to find a job? How are you going to find a way to like meet or make your ends meet? And I was lucky because I had those things starting out. But when I was in a relationship and we bought a house together, there was no issue. Nobody did a background check. There was no whatever. When we broke up and I tried to move into town, all of a sudden nobody wanted to rent to me. Everybody was just considering my criminal record. Everybody was whatever. And I had two options to get through that. One was I used the network that I built because I'm always trying to build networks. I'm always trying to build relationships. I'm always trying to basically understand how I can navigate with people in a way to benefit them and to benefit me. Like, not as a transactional thing, but just as a relational thing, because we all need connection. We're all looking for community. The other one was I just started trying odd things. So I looked on Facebook Marketplace and I found somebody who specifically didn't do credit checks and didn't do background checks. All he wanted was proof of income and a couple references. I could give him that. I had a job and I had references. So that allowed me to get in the door. And he didn't know about me until more than a year later when I actually did a presentation at his church on prison reentry. And he was like, I had no idea. Like, I wish I had known, whatever. So sometimes it's about showing up and basically showing people who you are. But often there are just challenges and barriers in place that the best way to get around them is to have the relationships that allow that to happen. And not everybody is relational. Not everybody it finds it as easy to like build relationships as I do. So I tell people that's a skill you can work on. More than anything, it's just the recognition that there are all these challenges and there is no right answer. So however someone gets through that, whether I know one guy who literally lived in his truck for a year now has 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times as much money as I do because he got used to that grind. He lived in his truck. He worked 2 jobs. He saved up money, bought a house. He built a business. He bought another business. He bought another business. He has a plane. Like, this dude flies down to Atlanta or to wherever to pick up his daughter when he picks her up for custody because he was used to that grind. Other people build relationships and rely on those relationships and rely on those networks. There are all sorts of ways to do it. There's no wrong way as long as someone is successful in re-entering into society.